Welcome, everybody. Welcome, colleagues, students, guests, family, friends around the world to the Fall 2021 Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sports Annual Distinguished Lecture. I'm Dr. Nicole Lavoie, the director of the Tucker Center. Thank you for joining us for this timely lecture and discussion about the surveillance of women in sport. To begin, we acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. As people residing on this land, we also acknowledge that it was cared for and called home by the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Ojibwe, Dakota, and other native peoples. Seated by the owners of the land we now occupy in multiple treaties, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty. I would love to tell you a little bit about the Tucker Center. For those of you that are new guests to the Tucker Center, and maybe for those that are familiar with the Tucker Center. We're located at the University of Minnesota. We were established in 1993 with the generous gift from Dr. Dorothy Tucker, a 1945 graduate of the University of Minnesota. The Tucker Center was the first interdisciplinary research center established within a major research university. Currently, we're a thought leader and a catalyst of systems change for girls and women in sport and physical activity. We do this through a threefold mission. We conduct solution-based research and we translate knowledge. We engage community outreach that impact girls and women in sport and physical activity, and we provide educational opportunities for undergraduates and graduates and our interns. To that end, I would like to acknowledge Mike and Van Mueller's contribution and scholarship in honor of their daughter, Edith Mueller, and whose support makes this lecture series possible, and whose gift supports student scholarship. Edith Mueller was a student in the Recreation, Park, and Leisure Studies program here at the University of Minnesota until her untimely death in 1982. A scholarship was created in her memory by her family, including her sister, Carrie Fritzie, to help support other students pursuing their degree and career. Every year, we honor the Mueller family at this event and announce the winner of the Edith Mueller Memorial Scholarship, who for 2021-22 is Mia Sanisardo, a University of Minnesota undergraduate student in sport management. Congratulations, Mia, and thank you again to the Muellers for their long-standing support. Given the Tucker Center is also housed within the School of Kinesiology within the College of Education and Human Development, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the director of the School of Kinesiology, Dr. Beth Lewis, and the dean of our college, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, for their ongoing support of the Tucker Center. No good work is done alone, and it takes the support of our administration and our colleagues that you will hear from shortly. So thank you to so many of you watching the webinar who also support our work. I love hearing from you and learning from you and how you use what we produce to create social good in your own communities around the globe. A special thanks to the Tucker team behind the scenes. I'm actually in the Tucker Center right now. To my Tucker team behind the scenes, Jonathan Sweet, Courtney Boucher, Hannah Silva Breen, and Efrat Abadi, as well as our many members of our undergraduate Tucker team, too many to name. Thank you so much for all your time and energy that you give every day to help me and the Tucker Center do what we do best. So before I frame up the panel and introduce the panelists, just a few housekeeping items. First, given this is a virtual event and I'm hoping in 2022 we'll be back live, and we're relying on technology. We will all agree up front, the panelists and us with the audience, that even though we're most all Zoom veterans, we're going to give each other grace in navigating this webinar. You never know what's going to happen. The order of events tonight, the batting order, if you will, where we will begin with, I'll introduce the panelists, I'll frame up what we're talking about surveillance, and then each panelist will begin with 5 minutes of remarks. Then we'll follow by a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll end with a moderated Q&A with questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please submit them as they arise using the Q&A function on Zoom, located at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer all your questions. We'll get to as many as we can in the time allowed. And I would invite you to post your comments and reactions using Twitter and tagging us using @TuckerCenter. Now, on to the main event. I would like to invite all the panelists to the screen, please. Excellent. So, because we have our largest distinguished lecture group ever, I'm not going to read all their bios because that would take way too long, because these are very accomplished women. So I am going to put a link in the chat to their bios, and you can read up on them, of all the great things that they do throughout the year. And I'll drop that in the chat right now to everybody. So I am just going to introduce the speakers in order of batting order, and they are going to just say hello, wave, and answer a key impromptu fun question. All right, so first up is Dr. Jamie Schultz. She's a professor of kinesiology at the University of Penn State and is an affiliate faculty appointment in women, gender, and sexual studies. So Jamie, if you could be a world champion in any sport, what would it be?
Gymnastics.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, next up, we have Anna Posberg. She's a PhD candidate and American Association for University Women Dissertation Fellow at the University of Maryland in the Department of Kinesiology and a former Tucker Center summer intern. Anna, if you could be a world champion in any sport, what would it be?
Women's pole vault.
All right. And I should say it probably shouldn't be in a sport that you actually did, but I'll let that one go. All right. So Dr. Nancy Lowe is the co-director of the Sport Research and Innovation Institute, newly formed, and a professor of higher education at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, otherwise known as UNLV. Nancy, what are you a world champion in?
Surfing.
Surfing, okay. Dr. Ann Peguerero is the co-director of the E-Alliance, a national network for research on gender equity in Canadian sport north of our border, and is the Lang Chair in Sport Management at the University of Guelph, and she would be a world champion in
pickleball.
Oh, nice. Dr. Beth Daniels is a research fellow and professor of psychology at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and she would be a world champion in?
I'll go with skateboarding.
Skateboarding. All right, I like we're mixing it up. Dr. Angel Brutus is a member of the USOPC, otherwise known as the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee's Mental Health Services team as part of the Department of Sports Medicine, and she would be a world champion in
spike ball.
All right. A lot of spike ball enthusiasts out there. Dr. Nefertiti Walker, sorry about that, Nef, is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer at UMass Amherst, and is an Associate Professor of Sport Management at the Eisenberg School of Management, a world champion in
Well, since I can't choose basketball, breakdancing.
All right. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Cheryl Cookie, who is a professor of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at our fellow Big Ten university, Purdue University. She would be a world champion in.
I got to go with cornhole.
Okay, no judgment on our sports of choice. I guess we could argue on a different panel if cornhole is actually a sport, but we don't have time for that
It's
tonight.
on ESPN, so it's a sport.
Okay, all right, stirring it up early and often, Dr. Cheryl Cookie. Well, I can tell you what, audience, we have quite a panel tonight that we have assembled. Each of these women could give their own distinguished lecture, but I have tasked them to give us a 5-minute overview of their expertise as it relates to the surveillance of women in sport. But before we begin with our panelists' comments, I think it's important for me to sort of set the tone and frame up what do we mean by surveillance? Because if I, asked everyone to put that in the chat, what does that mean to you? I'm guessing we might have some different answers. So a close watch kept over someone or something is the common definition in the dictionary of surveillance. Tonight, we're discussing surveillance of women in sport from multiple perspectives and the implications of that surveillance on women. To be clear, surveillance of women in general and women athletes in particular is not new, nor is it novel. However, with interest in, attention to, and the visibility of women's sport currently on the rise, as you'll see with the data tonight, the time is right to tackle the topic of continued and perhaps increased and intensified surveillance of women athletes and their bodies from a scholarly perspective. We are going to explore surveillance in all its forms as mechanisms of containment that limit or thwart momentum and popularity of women athletes, their performance, and the sports they play. Many types of surveillance exist. So it's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. Social media, likes, GPS, phones, body scanners at the airports, big data, CCTV, drones, satellites, biometrics, wearable technology, cameras, organizational policies. And let's not forget human forms of surveillance, such as managers, coaches, parents, and fans. Surveillance isn't just about monitoring or observing behavior of women athletes, but also that women themselves feel monitored. From the perspective of Foucault, the power of surveillance also functions to create a feeling of always being watched, so that we become self-policing and internalize self-perceptions. We'll hear about that the culture of sport also acts as an agent of surveillance that is gendered, sexist, and racist. That has meaning and implications for all sportswomen. So tonight, you'll hear perspectives from the historical and ongoing forms of surveillance that are situated in our current socio-political context, which we live and play. Then we'll shift to the current and rapidly changing business of women in sport and how sport media data reflects those trends. From there, we'll travel to psychological implications of surveillance on sportswomen and media portrayals of girls and women in sport. Then we'll back it back out and look at sociocultural implications of surveillance, especially for women with various intersectional identities. I know that you will find this panel of multidisciplinary experts thought-provoking. So with no further ado, our first speaker and panelist is Dr. Jamie Schultz.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to try to get this right. Does that look okay? Somebody tell me if it doesn't, please.
Looks great, Jamie.
Thank you, Nicole. And speaking of surveillance, as soon as I said gymnastics, I got a text from a very prominent soccer coach who wrote gymnastics with multiple question marks. And I said I panicked, but I would be a national champion in anything that would have me. So thank you very much, Nicole. That was a great, great setup. And I'm so honored to be here, to be associated with the Tucker Center, and to be associated with this amazing panel of scholars. So I'm going to take a historical view, and by historical, I mean primarily US women's sports, roughly in the first half of the 20th century. All right, what do I need to do to advance this? There we go. All right, scholars Tess Kay and Ruth Jeans write that the history of women's sport is one of substantial exclusion. That exclusion, they argue, was justified through a confluence of three rationales: social, medical, and aesthetic. Modern sport developed in the 19th century as a male preserve, to use the phrase of sociologist Eric Dunning. It was a space for boys and men to cultivate, perform, and validate culturally sanctioned versions of masculinity, often to the exclusion of women. This implied that women might taint or spoil this sacrosanct activity. It also implied that women with interest or talent in sport must not be real women, or that sport would somehow render them masculine, as these examples suggest. Altogether, the general idea was that women ruin sport and sport ruins women. Consequently, physicians, physical educators, and sports administrators argued that women must be kept out of sport for their own good, a consequence of what the author Colette Dowling refers to as the frailty myth. Of course, gendered fragility is rooted in particular ideologies of race, class, geography, and culture. Only certain women could afford to be frail. To engage in sport was to jeopardize one's health, and even more, to jeopardize one's potential for procreation. As reported in an 1898 issue of the Journal of Physical Education, violent movements of the body can cause a loosening of the uterus, with resulting sterility, thus defeating a woman's true purpose in life, that is, the bringing forth of strong children, her true purpose. At the same time, medical advice cautioned that menstruation was proof that women should not be athletes. Even as late as 1939, one physician insisted that menstruation alone disqualifies a woman from competitive sport. The major problem with this type of condemnation was that there was no actual medical research to back it up. It didn't matter. With the veneer of objectivity, medical discourse manifested in both surveillance and self-surveillance to restrict women's athletic development. The aesthetic rationale against women's sport participation took on three interrelated forms. First, it held that women athletes made for an unattractive spectacle. Second, critics charged that playing sports made women ugly. And third, that sport was a haven for the homely. As popular sports journalist Paul Gallico wrote in 1938, the ugly ducklings, and I'm quoting here, the ugly ducklings have taken to sport as an escape and to compensate for whatever it is they lack: sex appeal, charm, ready-made beauty. And that's the end of the quote. As women slowly became more involved in sport, those rationales for exclusion transformed into rationales for surveillance. The question became not how to keep women out of sport entirely, but rather how to keep men's and women's sports separate and different from one another. The answers to this question effectively relegated women athletes to secondary status. One strategy was to ensure that girls and women played by different rules. Another was to ensure that they played different sports, and this included designating certain activities as gender appropriate and rewarding athletes for their appropriate femininity as it related to race, social class, and heteronormativity. Yet another tactic was to control what women wore, and you can see this highlighted on the right there. In 1914, for example, the American Olympic Committee opposed women taking, and this is a quote again, women taking part in any event in which they could not wear long skirts. And still another was to ensure that the public that women athletes were real women. This included continued surveillance of menstruation and maternity, as well as various forms of sex testing, as Anna's going to cover in just a moment. With all of this in mind, women's sport has certainly come a long way, and that progress has generated new forms of surveillance. But I argue that new technologies of surveillance simply reignite old anxieties. And by way of explanation, let me conclude with 3 examples. First, women's clothing remains a subject of fascination, scrutiny, derision, and regulation. These images represent just a smattering of recent controversies, which unfortunately I don't have enough time to get into today. New regulations, this is my second point, new regulations that concern women's endogenous testosterone merely dress up older iterations of sex testing by targeting suspicious-looking women. In much the same way, the recent spate of legislation to exclude trans girls and women is predicated on the need for protection or salvation or fairness, when there are far more serious threats to the preservation and continued growth of women's sports. And with that, I will turn it over to the brilliant Anna Posberg.
Thank you so much for starting us off strong, Jamie. So I will move into contemporary policies. Specifically, it's an idea that I talk about in my dissertation as protective policies. And these are iterations, new iterations of surveillance, specifically in the form of policies. And so, like I said, I introduced this idea in my dissertation that to denote policies that seek to protect women athletes by ensuring women's safety and health, defending fairness in women's sports, and ultimately preventing the violation of sociocultural and medical boundaries that define who counts as a woman. And policies is a bit of a misnomer here because these surveillance mechanisms emerge through multiple strategies. But tonight, or wherever you are this afternoon or morning, I want to focus on written documents that provide rules or guidelines that monitor women's bodies and behaviors. And specifically, as you'll see on my slide here, I'll focus on a policy for transgender athlete eligibility, a policy for female athlete eligibility, and a consensus statement for relative energy deficiency in sport. And I focus on these 3 examples because each was created for the purpose of protecting women athletes through surveillance strategies. The transgender eligibility policy I look at sets a limit of 5 nanomoles of testosterone per liter of blood for trans women with no similar regulation for trans men. The female eligibility policy, which is, as many have argued, a newer iteration of sex testing, limits the naturally occurring testosterone levels of women competing in specific track and field events, also to 5 nanomoles of testosterone per liter of blood. And lastly, the consensus statement provides guidelines for sports organizations, physicians, coaches, and athletes on how to prevent, diagnose, and treat athletes suspected of having relative energy deficiency in sport. And together, all 3 of these documents reflect the malleability or tensions of surveillance through science-driven policies. And in particular, these tensions appear in 3 ways. First, why protective policies are created. Second, what is considered appropriate evidence in protective policies. And third, how to implement protective policies. So first, protective policies are created for various reasons, many of which Jamie spoke about. Some of these reasons are historical or cultural, whereas others focus more on the medical aspects of women's bodies. As part of my dissertation, I interviewed scientists who were involved with the creation of protective policies, and their answers reflected the myriad reasons why these policies were created. Scientist F, for example, as you can see on the right of my slide, spoke about the historical exclusion of women due to social, medical, and aesthetic rationales. Scientist C incorporated a notable intersection of surveillance with race and nationality when talking about policies that impact trans women or women with purportedly higher than normal natural testosterone levels. Scientist C remarks that because many of these athletes are from developing countries, they've been undiagnosed and not offered treatment. And because of the potential for financial exploitation in sports, there's a subsequent need to identify these women and offer Western forms of treatment. And finally, when commenting on the impacts of relative energy deficiency in sport, or as it's been previously referred to, the female athlete triad, Scientist A highlights how this condition is far more common in women with potentially more serious implications for their reproduction and fertility. And within these reasons for creating protective policies, there's also multiple types of evidence brought in to support or guide the creation of these policies. Most often, there's a preference for scientific discourses given medicine's veneer of objectivity, but there are caveats with this general consensus. First, and as Scientist G points out, sometimes any kind of scientific evidence is good enough. When talking about the science behind female eligibility, Scientist G notes that even not the best paper in the world is good enough because of its identity as a peer-reviewed, published scientific paper. Taking a different approach, Scientist B points out that protection is not an individual problem, it's a cultural problem that requires cultural solutions. And because of this, there's an imminent need to combine biological and sociocultural forms of evidence when constructing protective policies. Lastly, and as I mentioned at the beginning, protective policies manifest in several ways, with policies being a bit of a misnomer. These implementation strategies can take the form of sex segregation, sex integration, policies, rules, consensus statements, top-down approaches, or bottom-up approaches, and different scientists believe in different mechanisms. Scientist H, for instance, believes that consensus statements are the way to go because policies are stagnant and don't take into consideration the immense variability of humans. Scientist A takes a polar opposite stance, saying that rules and policies are vital, otherwise there's an anything goes kind of attitude. And taking a more holistic viewpoint, Scientist B implores the need for athletes and coaches to speak out and put pressure on sports organizations to create meaningful and appropriate regulatory documents. Ultimately, the complexity of protective policies lies in their differing rationales, forms of evidence, and strategies. Protective policies are developed through messy and contentious processes, which in turn create uneven and differing experiences for women athletes along race, class, geographical, and cultural lines. Taken as a whole, and in the context of surveillance, this culminates in several tensions around their development and enforcement, and brings up questions on how to move forward in ways that hold the best interests of women athletes and women's sports at heart. And with that, I'll hand it off to the brilliant Dr. Nancy Lowe.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to begin first by sharing my screen. All right, does that look good?
Good.
Right. I'm definitely going to shift the focus a little bit here and go towards more of a business perspective. One of the most dominant narratives framing women's sport repeated over time is the adage, no one's interested in women's sport. This narrative comes first from media producers who have effectively limited the opportunity for access to women's sport among consumers and fans by limiting their coverage of women's sport. But the lack of coverage has a multiplier effect because audiences are built by media hype. The larger the audience, the more likely investment will be made in broadcast rights, supported by advertisers who see value in the sport. Sponsors then invest in the sport, paying for key elements, which in turn build the brand. The stronger the brand and visibility, the more likely merchandise sales, which grow further exposing the women's sport product and brand, and then encourages more investment from additional sponsors. This cycle is typical of the traditional model used successfully by mainstream sport properties. Yet this model has effectively suppressed the economic value of women's sport due to the systemic surveillance at each step in the process. In direct contrast to this narrative that no one's interested in women's sport, Nielsen found 84% of sport fans are interested in women's sport, and 66% of the population was interested in at least one women's sport. And this study included major European countries, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. A second point of surveillance has been the notion that women's sport only appeals to women. Yet the data shows a near even split, with as many men as women interested in women's sport. This is an important point because sport marketers have largely failed in their efforts to market women's sport and women athletes. Go to my next slide. Oops, there we go. Case in point, the NCAA Division I Women's Basketball National Championship event. After years of steadily increasing ticket sales, viewership, and ratings of the women's tournament, in 2021, for the first time, ESPN nationally broadcast all 63 games, resulting in the highest viewership, averaging 4.1 million viewers. As was found in the NCAA External Gender Equity Review conducted in 2021, their own media consultant estimated that the Division I Women's Basketball Championship is worth between 81 and 112 million annually in broadcast rights. This is a value that would have never previously been determined because the NCAA lumped women's basketball in with all other sports in one broadcast contract. This systemic suppression of the value of women's basketball offers today as evidence of the failure of the traditional male model to recognize the need for audience access through broadcast rights that then grow further interest. This case is also evidence of the shift in generational attitudes, actions, and consumption patterns. The tweet from Sedona Prince, a player on the University of Oregon women's basketball team, spurred the controversy that led to the Gender Equity Review. With this action, we would still not know the value of women's basketball broadcast rights, which clearly have been grossly underestimated for years. As a result of her tweet, And the report, the March Madness brand will now be extended to women's basketball starting in 2022 for the first time. Oops. Merchandise sales are another key component and revenue driver that remains suppressed in women's sport. Merchandise sales have not kept pace with demand as evidenced by this slide. Here we see the WNBA and LPGA hoodies, which sold out, the Ionescu jersey, US Women's National Team jersey, Heath jersey, all sold out while setting records that eclipsed those of men's jersey sales. Any economic model dictates supply must meet demand to generate more revenue and to build the brand. Yet repeatedly, demand has exceeded supply, suppressing the true value women's sport is capable of producing. Much of this is attributable to the athletes taking back their power from the system that has failed them. This iconic image from the ESPYs captures the strong, resilient women of USA Gymnastics who stood up to the powerful national governing body and created real change to the system, a shift in power, if you will. Power is now more in the athletes' hands because they have collectively demanded change. This is a big shift from previous generations who were grateful for crumbs and fearful of retribution and retaliation if they denounced abuse and sexual harassment. The power shifting is now towards athletes through their platforms, their celebrity status, their social media visibility, and their voice. It's further evidenced by fans becoming advocates for equality and voicing their support, as we saw at the FIFA World Cup. Athletes like Osaka stand up to critics, creating awareness that she is a person, not just an athlete, changing the narrative on mental health and the treatment of athletes. This exemplifies the generational shift that's challenging the system. Power shifting towards sponsors also of women's sport, many of whom are now advocates, like Budweiser taking out this New York Times ad prompting continued support of the US women's national team and women's soccer after the World Cup. And other sponsors like Secret stepping up to pay the players and eliminate the pay gap of $23,000 per player, resulting in a nearly $500,000 commitment. We're now seeing sponsors going all in on advocacy. Google messaging support for women's sport during WNBA games, and more importantly, changing their algorithms so searches on Google identify women athletes and women's sport. When algorithms change, so do the search results. Oops. With new metrics being used to quantify interest in women's sport and women athletes, results are inspiring. Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, and Ashlyn Harris were identified as the most marketable athletes in the world, and this included male athletes, demonstrating that a new model with new metrics can more accurately reflect the true and growing interest in women's sport. The business case for women's sport is being built. This new model exposes the surveillance and suppression that has been in place and is now being transformed. Growth in audience and fan avidity is now captured with new metrics. More data is being captured, making the case for a different narrative. The new narrative needed today is one reflecting the emerging economic model that captures the value of women's sport. Much of this is directly attributable to the millennials, the Gen Z women who have taken power into their own hands through social media to challenge the systems that have failed them and failed women's sport. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Ann Pecoraro, a social media expert, to further explore this topic.
Thanks, Nancy. I'll share my screen. Okay, so when Nancy led right into the topic for me, which is about what the media's role in all of this. So when I think about the research that we've done and we look at framing, it's really about the media doesn't tell us what to think, but it really frames and tells us what to think about. So in terms of women's sport, the long-term research done by Dr. Kuki, who's with us today, shows that over time, we really haven't seen a lot of change in what the sports media is showing us, really. So it's telling us that it doesn't really think much about women's sports, and neither should we. Interestingly, recently, Darren Rovell asked his Twitter followers if they actually watch SportsCenter, and many of them don't. So maybe this isn't such a problem if people actually aren't watching SportsCenter, they're not seeing women's sport. But also from Dr. Cookie's research, we see that the traditional news is only about 8% are having women's sports stories, a little bit better on social media, which is the world we'll talk a little bit more about tonight. but it's still not great. If only 8 of 93 people led with the story about women's sports. And when we dive into those stories that actually are about women's sports, this research that came out this year is pretty groundbreaking from Dr. Walker's colleagues at UMass Amherst and Dr. Nicole Melton and Dr. Riza Izzard. They looked at the actual stories about women's sport and took a look at who's being talked about in WNBA, 550 articles, and we see that there's a real racial bias in how women are being covered by news. The best thing that came out of this, I think, from my perspective, is that the WNBA is actually talking about top performers in their league and not having the same bias. But when you see white players getting twice as many mentions as black players dominating awards, and white players were dominating the conversation. And it's continuing. This individual put on Twitter, they looked at the Getty images and seeing that Serena Ionescu is by far getting more pictures putting out there, even when she's not playing, well over Charlie Collier. But we also know when we show women's sports, it breaks records. And as a Canadian, I'd be remiss not to show this picture of the Canadian team winning the gold medal at the Olympics this year. 4.4 million people watched that game in Canada. And you don't think, it's not very much. In terms of our population, that's almost 12% of Canadians turned in to watch it. More than watch the Stanley Cup finals. And if you know anything about Canada, that's a big thing. And more than watch the Euro men's final. So we're seeing every time you put women's sports on TV, it breaks records. People are watching the WNBA draft. They're treating it like men's sports. So when they can watch it, they're watching it. And this past season, the WNBA broke a lot of viewership records and is increasing and showing the interest that Dr. Lowe showed in her presentation. When we switch to social media, so we take it outside of the traditional media and we say, what's important about this disruptor that's come into the market for us? So we see that social media plays a big role for athletes individually. So individuals, you and I who are on social media, we're more likely to follow athletes than we are to follow their teams, their leagues, or their federations. We're more likely to talk about or show pictures of athletes as athletes themselves. And there's a real opportunity for women athletes to grab a hold of these media platforms and turn themselves into brands, much like we saw in Nancy's presentation. Just in the most recent games, the most talked about and mentioned athletes were predominantly women during the games. So it has a big power for women athletes to be seen when the traditional media doesn't show it. And we see that two women play in a final of a major event like the US Open. This is the increase in the followers on their platforms that both of these athletes got. So the increasing surveillance, the increasing interest is coming when they're in a final. And of course, when you win, you get more followers. Going back to the NCAA this year in the women's game, we saw the biggest rise in followers, mostly for women athletes during the tournament. And if you think about that in the age of nil that's about hitting us now, this is going to have massive power for women athletes. And the growth is insane. If you look at almost 367% for Ari McDonald, and then now she's in the WNBA and can monetize that. But going back to what we said and what Dr. Cookie's research shows us, only 10% of online articles are actually talking about women's sport. And so if I'm a fan of women's sports and I want to actually surveil it or watch it, what do I have to do? I have to create my own content. We took a look at about 1,500, I think, photos that were shared on the hashtag #SheBelieves about the US women's national team. And we found overwhelming majority, 90% of fans are sharing photos of these women as athletes performing their sports. So they want to see them as athletes. And when we see athletes sharing their own in other research we've done, we see their most liked photos happen to be them as an athlete or showing their success. And yet the sexualized images they show also garner a lot of attention. And in terms of surveillance, we're seeing this continue as new sports join us, such as climbing. The media is still going back to the way that they've always covered women's sport. And this climber in particular is talking about the sexualized nature of the coverage. And so I'll leave you as we move to Dr. Beth Daniels to just remind you again, media is not telling you what to think, but it's telling you what to think about.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to turn us in a slightly different direction and focus on the psychological impacts of different kinds of media portrayals of female athletes. And I'm particularly interested in this as a developmental psychologist and thinking about how these kinds of media portrayals affect adolescent girl viewers, as well as young adult women viewers. So here you can see one way in which female athletes are typically portrayed in the media as sexual objects. So this connects with this idea of surveillance. So as an athlete, they're portrayed as sex objects. And I want to direct your attention to the top left corner of your screen, where you can see a really striking contrast where Misty May Trainer, the GOAT, arguably, of beach volleyball, portrayed in a sexualized manner, alongside her husband, who's clearly portrayed as a professional male athlete. So my interest has been in how do these kinds of images affect girls, and contrasting that to how sport performance images affect girls. So in some of my own research, I've showed either sport performance images, as you can see on the left, or sexualized images, as you can see on the right, to adolescent girls and young adult women, and ask them to think about the images and then complete the sentence "I am," describing themselves. So let me give you a little bit of the data that I've collected, and you can get a sense for how these images affect these viewers. So in response to sport performance images, here you can see that girls are talking about how these images make them feel powerful, able, strong. They reflect on their own sport competence. I'm a good soccer player. And that's the dominant response these images produced in my sample of almost 300 adolescent girls and 225 college women. And so that, again, is the dominant response, but it's not the only response. So in the lower right corner, you can see that there are some sort of negative responses, right? So some viewers see these images and reflect on their lack of their athletic competence. Now turning to how girls and women respond to sexualized images of female athletes. And here you see quite a different picture. So several examples to consider here. Girls are saying, you know, after I see these images, I feel ugly, not pretty, even the ugliest girl in the world. I'm never going to look as pretty as these girls. So overwhelmingly, the responses were really surveillance of their own bodies, and then negative self-evaluations that focus on their appearance and their attractiveness, nothing about their sport competence. So again, this is the dominant response, but in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see an example of a small number of participants who didn't have that experience and were able to still maintain positive sense of their own appearance. In this study, I also asked girls and women to just sort of think about and tell me their reactions more broadly to these kinds of images. And in the top example here, this is in response to a sport performance media image. A teen girl reported, "In this photo, Mia Hamm runs her heart out for the love of one game. Although I'm not a soccer player, this gives me a sense of determination to achieve my goal, even if it doesn't involve a soccer ball. This photo represents women who are strong." So here clearly we have a very positive reaction to this image. It's about being a role model and sort of breaking some gender stereotypes. Down below though, however, we see again a very different reaction to a sexualized media image of a female athlete. And this teen girl says, "This picture doesn't portray the real woman. She is a tennis star. She may be beautiful, but before she is beautiful, she is strong, fast, quick-footed, and agile. She's supposed to be a role model, not a model. Her ditzy seductive stare and quote unquote sexy pose is supposed to make her desirable, but the only thing I desire is to turn over the page." So quite a negative response, critiquing the objectification of this female athlete via this sexualized media image. So how do athletes, when given the choice, want to portray themselves? So in the mainstream media, of course, individual athletes won't have much power over that for the most part, but social media, as Anne and Nancy both discussed, is a very different domain. And so the existing research that Anne summarized, we can also look at some studies done with college students by both Tucker Center researchers and researchers at Bowling Green State University, Vicki Crane and colleagues, where they have asked athletes if you could choose, how would you want to be portrayed in the media? And overwhelmingly across a number of studies, these college student athletes choose powerful sport performance images and are unlikely to choose sexualized images. So again, when given the choice, that is how they want to be portrayed. So kind of wrapping up, I'll offer two recommendations. One is that sport performance media images of female athletes might make girls and women feel more positively about their own physical capabilities. And that arguably is a great case for why we need more of these images in our media environments. And then secondly, other research looking at girls in terms of body perceptions, we know that when girls feel poorly about their bodies, physical activity or sport participation can promote more positive body attitudes and help girls focus on their physical capabilities. So with that, I will pass the baton to Angel.
Thanks so much, Beth. And yes, so we're going to transition a little bit of the conversation and talk a little bit more in terms of the lived experiences of young women in sport who are targeted for surveillance. And before I do that, I will say that as a member of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee staff, it is my duty to be able to give a brief disclosure, which means that any of the statements that I make are my own and not that as a representation of the USOPC or any of its affiliates. And with that, we'll get started. So, so far we heard a lot in terms of social media, portrayal, media portrayal, all of these things. But what does this mean in terms of the lived experiences of the athletes that we are talking about today, specifically those who identify as women? In my world, looking at some of the applied work that we do, oftentimes we'll find situations where we are encountering athletes who are experiencing a phenomenon called stereotype threat. And for those of us that don't know necessarily what that means, in a nutshell, it just means that you are multitasking your cognitive resources based off of the saliency of your identity. And that can have some significant implications on the way that you show up in the different spaces and places that you navigate. And specifically as women competing in sport, knowing how important and intricate the nuances that go into the day-to-day operations of ultimately elite level, high level performance, there's so much at stake. So specifically, when you think about this experience of being surveilled, or in other words, being policed in many ways, whether it's policies and procedures that tell you that you're supposed to have a certain body type, whether it is media portrayal that continues to perpetuate a message in terms of what you're supposed to look like, the representation that either exists or does not exist in that media portrayal, as we've seen earlier. Even when you get beyond the gender binary and you look at race and you look at ethnicity and representation there, we have a lot of work to do. And these are messages that sometimes, if not careful, can be internalized by the athletes who are constantly being encroached with these particular messages, whether they are seeking it out or whether it's infringing on their experiences uninvited. And so with that, when we think about this idea or this concept of stereotype threat and what it means specifically in a performance domain such as sport, we also have to understand that there are stereotypes and stigmas that are attached to many of our identities. And I know that Nev coming up is going to talk about intersectionality specifically. But as a woman competing in sport across different sport types, it's important to understand just how much those messages have an impact on the ability to perform. And specifically, what that says in terms of those I am statements and I am messages that we just heard about earlier. This is where we get into the clinical lens, and sometimes it might not even be a clinical lens specifically, but where it activates the different core beliefs that we have. Oftentimes, as individuals and as human beings, our negative core beliefs are easier to activate because, as a human nature, anytime we show up in a space or in a room, we're constantly scanning our environments for safety. Hence the reason why it's easier to pick up on all of the negative aspects and activate the negative network. And it takes so much more cognitive resources and space and energy to activate the positive network. And so while it might seem that it doesn't have much of an impact, it really does. So when you saw earlier the depiction of different media portrayals of certain athletes who voiced their opinion and their concerns about individuals who might have something to say about in terms of relegating athletes to just sticking within their sport realm and not necessarily getting involved with other areas of concern or issues of concern. It really depends on the saliency of that athlete's identity. So for example, there was mention about the WNBA. Just the mere premise of putting women in front of the title of NBA, it's already priming the identity of those individuals who identify as women. Well, what does that mean? That's going to be unique to the actual individual. For some individuals, it could be other identities that come across in the intersection. It could be Black women. Which identity is salient in that particular environment? And so when we look at navigating certain environments in certain contexts and under this guise of surveillance, it's interesting to consistently consider how much of this messaging is actually priming a person's identity. For example, if I'm filling out demographic information and I am going to be a research participant and the demographic information or questioning asks about my gender, asks about my race, or asks about my age, whether I am intentionally thinking about it or not, any of the performances that I do following that, my identity has been primed. And depending on what the stereotype or the stigma that's attached to any one of those identities has also been primed. And what are the implications for that in terms of performance? Specifically, when it comes to performance, anytime our identities are primed and we show that we have a sense of belonging to a specific social identity group or category, if there is a negative stigma attached to that identity within that particular performance domain, then two things could possibly occur. Either the individual is going to overcompensate to disprove the myth that's attached to the stigma or the identity or the stereotype, or the individual is going to retreat in order to avoid confirming any stigma or stereotype that's attached to the identity. And so when we think about the performance implications and how this shows up specifically under this guise of surveillance, these are things that we have to consider in terms of how women's identities are constantly being primed and how much cognitive resources and energy is taking place in order to either debunk the myth of the stereotype or either retreat from it. And either way, we're getting the possibility of a recipe for underperformance. And so with that, I will pass the baton to Neff to take us further into intersectionality.
Thank you, Angel. I was jotting down notes and you have just earned yourself a guest lecture in my class to cover stereotype threat because you did it better than I ever have. So thank you for that. Good evening, folks. My name is Nefertiti Walker and I feel very fortunate to be in the company of such brilliant women today. Thank you so much, Nicole, for inviting me. So the area that I felt most comfortable discussing for this panel is how the surveillance of women impacts those who identify as having multiple marginalized identities. Sport in general is not inclusive to women, it is not inclusive to Black people, and it's not inclusive to LGBTQ plus folks. I'm sure there are other groups that I'm missing, but I focus on those three groups in particular today. And yes, certain sports at certain times include one or more of these particular identities or these three groups, but generally speaking, sport is not inclusive to those three groups of people. Some empirical evidence for this claim, because I would imagine for some people that's a pretty bold claim to make, that I'll share with you today is an article published by me and Dr. Nicole Melton back in 2015 in the Journal of Sport Management. And the title of this article was The Tipping Point, the intersection of race, gender, and sexual orientation in intercollegiate sport. This project, we interviewed women who were working in intercollegiate sport in various different positions, both as coach as well as on the business side, the management side of intercollegiate sport. We found that the more marginalized identities that an individual had, the more likely they were to experience a sport culture that treated them unfairly, mainly unjustly. So deductively speaking, there's this accumulating effect on the experiences of people in sport based on the number of marginalized identities that one has. This project in particular was grounded in intersectionality in the body of work by the brilliant Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined this term intersectionality back in 1989 in law work, as well as feminist standpoint theory. And we conducted semi-structured interviews with current and former intercollegiate sport employees. So what the findings of this particular study revealed is that the more these women expressed their marginalized identities, the more the sport organization tried to control them, suggesting what many of my colleagues here today have already expressed, which is that surveillance and control go hand in hand. So I give you one example from our research project. A Black lesbian assistant coach, basketball coach, working at a D1 institution in the Southeast, shared a story of how, although everyone else in their particular institution had the norm, it was part of their culture to bring their kids to work on days off. So if it was a holiday or over winter break, they would bring their kids in maybe for a half a day, and that was totally cool in their particular sport organization. But so it was winter break, and this particular participant in our study decided to have their partner, who was also a woman, drop their kid off in their athletic department to hang out with them for the rest of the day. An associate athletic director walked by and asked who kids were here with her. And she told the associate athletic director, that these are my kids. And they moved on. Nothing else was said. Well, the next day, the head coach sat down this particular participant, who's an assistant coach, and told them that they spoke with the associate athletic director, and they don't want them bringing their kids into the workplace. And this was told to this particular person, even though many others brought their kids in before and after this incident took place. There were many other stories of how these individuals, in particular, were, again, surveilled and attempted to control in their particular environments based, again, on these identities and the way that they express these identities, mainly being the intersection of their race, gender, and their sexual orientation. This level of surveillance and attempt at controlling the behaviors of these women caused many of the women in our study to eventually leave intercollegiate sport in particular. And although this level of surveillance and control happens to all women, women who also have one or more marginalized identity tend to pose a bigger threat to status quo sport culture and are pushed out through these means of treatment discrimination, like the example that I shared tonight, or voluntary turnover. And this, from the research that we did, as well as other research conducted in this area, actually current research that we're working on, a team, having similar conversations with women's basketball coaches as a whole, what we're finding is that the folks that leave on voluntary turnover, they're leaving because they're burnt out on code switching and covering their marginalized identities. So if they're a lesbian, if they're LGBTQ+, they identify as having one of those identities, they are hiding those particular identities in the workplace. They're not talking about their partners. They're not mentioning any kids unless they're mentioning a male partner as well. So again, eventually these women just get tired of the act and they leave their particular sport organizations. So how do we mitigate the surveillance of women in sport in particular? One option that I want to quickly introduce is the creation of counter spaces. Counter spaces is a term that's coined in contemporary literature, at least, by Dr. Mashir Keel. And they are similar to safe spaces. They are pockets of resistance embedded within larger contexts. And they enable individuals from marginalized groups to engage in collective disruption of the dominant narrative of the larger institution. So counter spaces are designed for individuals from marginalized groups, but they can welcome allies from advantaged groups as long as they adhere to the goal of supporting, again, those folks from the marginalized groups. In my opinion, the WNBA in many ways has served as a counter space to the larger institution, or in opposition to the culture of exclusion in sport. The W isn't perfect, although I kind of think it is, but the W is not perfect, but they have prioritized the intersectional inclusion of their players. The WNBA was one of the first, if not the first, professional sport league to embrace Pride Nights, for example, and other programs that welcomed LGBTQ+ folks. Also, if you watch the WNBA finals this year, you probably saw that the Chicago Sky now have the first known same-sex married couple to win a professional championship as married teammates. Finally, the WNBA seemed to support and embrace Layshia Clarendon's journey toward having top surgery this year. So again, if you think about, and certainly many of us probably followed the WNBA's journey to becoming this league that was vocal during the disruption and the racial reckoning in the summer of 2020, as well as they now have multiple social advocacy groups. And again, they just totally embrace this idea of racial justice in our country through their work. Watching some of the elections in our country, they've been able to disrupt local elections, Senate elections, again, using their collective power and creating this counter space to disrupt the narrative of oppression in sport and even beyond. So again, I think the WNBA has offered a case study on how to mitigate some aspects of exclusion, as well as some aspects of the surveillance of women in sport. The W has offered an intersectional approach to resisting the surveillance and the control so often pitted against women in sport, with an inclusive and welcoming counter space. I would like to now pass the mic to Professor Cheryl Cookie, whose very famed and impactful research has been mentioned a few times tonight.
Thank you. I apologize for the transition. I was busy taking notes, and I think I filled up my notebook. This has just been such a great panel. Before I begin, I'd like to extend a warm thank you to Dr. Nicole Lavoie and the Tucker Center for extending the invitation for me to participate in this esteemed panel. I'm very grateful to be a part of this conversation. I've been asked to speak on the sociological implications of surveillance on women's sports and how we might begin making sense of the myriad forms of surveillance that we've talked about on this panel. And so this is quite a big task, and I'm going to try to do my best here to maybe get us thinking about some things, but hope certainly we'll be able to continue the conversation in the Q&A, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this as well. Social change in women's sports does not follow a linear or progressive trajectory. I think as Jamie, who began our conversation looking at kind of the historical factors, sort of set us up to think about. Rather, it's best characterized by both progress and backlash, empowerment and misogyny, change and continuity. These dynamics often operate simultaneously within the same institutional or organizational space. And here I'm thinking in particular about the US women's national team's competitive success, coupled with their struggles to earn equal pay, and the recent revelations of sexual harassment within the women's professional soccer league. And certainly there were other examples that came up in our discussion today. And while the surveillance that we've discussed today is not new, I want to make the argument that there are distinctive articulations of it. In other words, the policing of women's sports around appearance, sexuality, marketing and growth potential, media coverage, sex, gender, race, and sexual identities, and others that we've talked about today is not new. Certainly, I think Jamie's discussion alluded to how some of the things that we're seeing today are really rooted in kind of historical or old anxieties around women's participation. I do want to suggest, though, that its manifestations and its meanings are particular to this socio-historical moment, to the contemporary context. So what makes the surveillance of today distinct? I see three main factors. First, what is distinctive about the surveillance is that it is occurring in a cultural context whereby feminism has become mainstream or popular, in the words of Sarah Benet Weiser. Understandings of gender and racial equality, feminist concepts and issues such as intersectionality, equal pay, sexual harassment, as well as understandings of systemic racism are increasingly integrated into wider American culture and in popular discourses. Moreover, this shift has provided a context by which athletes are especially empowered to speak out in ways they have not been in the past. And I really appreciated the discussion about sort of thinking about the WNBA as a counter space. I thought that was very provocative and might really sort of be a great example of kind of the distinctive ways that these athletes are being empowered today in ways that we haven't seen in the past. So this is in large part due to the emergent and new social media, which I see as a second way that their surveillance of today is distinctive relative to other forms of surveillance in the past. And certainly a number of panelists have raised the issue of social media. Social media and other emergent media platforms allow for athletes, fans, advocates, academics to bypass legacy media and speak directly to and with one another. Social media's affordances also allow for an amplification of messages that can have real and meaningful change. I think Nancy talked about this in her discussion, but I was thinking about the viral post depicting the gross inequalities between the NCAA women's and men's basketball tournament and the training or weightlifting facilities, which became a national story and precipitated a report and real changes to addressing inequality in the NCAA tournament, which Nancy discussed. There's another example, the hashtag Gymnast Alliance, which is a global hashtag that addresses physical and verbal abuse along with sexual abuse, wherein gymnasts across the world are speaking out about the abuse that they confront as being participants in their sport. The conversations regarding mental health, which took place recently, several high-profile athletes declining to participate in major international events, and I think we've mentioned here Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, but certainly I think the ways in which athletes, both men and women, but particularly women athletes, are raising awareness around mental health and advocating for mental health issues. At the same time, and this third point speaks to the first point regarding the kind of unevenness of social change, all of this real and meaningful social change in women's sports is happening within the broader political context where in the US, wherein anti-trans discourses are being mobilized under the guise of gender equality and protecting women, as both Jamie and Anna discussed. So the conversation for me raises important questions that we must critically interrogate. How might thinking of surveillance of women's sports as indicative of both change and continuity help to understand the contemporary manifestations of surveillance, but also offer insights for feminist interventions, advocacy, and activism? How might we rethink and reimagine contemporary forms of surveillance in ways that recognize the potential for surveillance to be turned on its head, if you will? In other words, how might we use the master's tools for better good and efforts for gender equality? Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Nicole, who is back at the Tucker Center.
Tuning in from the Tucker Center. Wow. I just have to sort of catch my breath and collect my thoughts. And I have so many pages of notes, I don't know where to start. So if I could invite all the panelists to come back off mute. Thank you so much for your wonderful, multidisciplinary, diverse, thought-provoking perspectives. Behind the scenes, some of the panelists are messaging each other like, let's do this every year. This is really fun. You know, we often don't get to talk to one another across disciplines. And this is one goal of this panel was to do that. So with all the different ground we've covered, from historical to psychological to media to business to performance to sociocultural to examples of counter surveillance and counter spaces. I want to give the panelists in the next couple minutes a chance to react to each other's and build upon our thoughts in this space. So when you were listening to each other, what did you want to jump in and say, yeah, I want to build on that? And let's start there, and then we'll go into some more specific questions. Anne, start us off.
Yeah, I think when Neff was talking and about the counter spaces, and I think about the ability to build those communities and have power in them, I really think that that was something that I want to jump on. And I think that first of all, great research, and second, I think it's definitely a way that different stakeholders in this can do something, can create those counter spaces and push back. So that one really caught me.
Mhm.
What else jumped out at people? I mean, there's so much to unpack. It's like, where do I start? Beth.
I was caught by Nancy's discussion about the merchandise, because I definitely get, I'm sure probably all of us get, friends and family and so forth asking, well, where do I get my 12-year-old, daughter a jersey for whatever, fill in the blank, awesome female athlete, and they're not there. So I was wondering, what is it going to take to change and push for, the availability of merchandising for, female athletes?
Well, I know
Jump in
that
there. Nicole, could I jump in and just give credit where credit is due? So Katie LaBelle, our colleague, is doing research in this space around merchandising. And to your point, we're trying to raise awareness. But Beth, I could see a study coming from your perspective that looked at the impact, right, on girls being able to wear jerseys or access how that makes them feel. I could see an interesting study there.
absolutely.
Let's collaborate, Nancy.
I was going to say the same about Katie LaBelle's work. If she's tuning in, we'll give her the proper shout out. But how frustrating is it as a fan of women's sport to be consistently denied the opportunity to purchase merchandise and limit the growth of merchandise sales? And that in itself is a sort of an insidious form of surveillance of sport fans. Angel.
No, I just really appreciated Anna really kicking off, helping us understand the different authorship perspectives of different policies that can honestly contribute to the policing and the surveillance of specifically women in sport. I think countless times of being in meetings and talking about protocols and procedures and policies, which from a legalese perspective, a lot of organizations are moving away from policies, because if you have a policy in place, and that means you have to follow it. And not many people do well with following policies. And so I really appreciate, Anna, how you just kind of parsed out, scientists A and B and C and where their lens and what their agenda is, because there's always an agenda behind the development of policies that is under the guise of protection. So really appreciated that.
Cheryl.
There were so many things that I appreciated about this panel. It's hard to sort of focus in on one, so I might actually do two. And as a sociologist, I think I was really intrigued, Angel, by your perspective, kind of coming at it from more of the psychological performance based, because that's not a world that I'm really well versed in. And I think for me as a scholar, I talk about women athletes in a kind of abstract way. And so I think what your contributions did for me was sort of to remind myself, like athletes are actual human beings, and that the kind of images that we're talking about in the research or the coverage, right, that actually might translate in kind of real and meaningful ways about how, I think Beth, you talked about this too, right? Not just girls seeing themselves, but then also like elite level athletes might be sort of thinking about themselves in terms of their performance and how those stereotypes might get triggered and what impact that has. And I also, I know I tried to do it justice, Jamie, so I just have to apologize because I wrote it down. I love the way that you frame this as new technologies. I think I wrote it down. I hope I got it right. New technologies reigniting old anxieties. And I just thought that was such a profound way of thinking about so much of what we've been talking about in this conversation. The sex testing, trans policies, but then also I think the media coverage, the appearance issues and body image issues, so many of the different things that we've been talking about. And certainly I think media coverage and marketing potential are a part of that as well. So I wanted to thank Jamie for sort of giving me kind of a really concise and provocative way of thinking through some of these things. So thank you.
I didn't realize I was unmuted, so I hope nothing embarrassing came through. But Cheryl, that's such a gracious and generous thing to say. And that's what's really struck me with this panel, is that everyone is just so gracious and generous. And, you know, we all learn so much from each other. I've learned so many, I don't know social media from my elbow, right? But like just all these different things, and just reminding us about this idea of the WNBA as a counter space, and policy, and who makes policy, and how it gets implemented, and stereotypes, right? You know, I was thinking about like this, what if we, you know, you want to collect that sort of demographic data at some point, right? But could we ask that at the end of a survey instead of at the beginning, so we don't prime people? And just so in just, I don't have anything relevant important to say, but Cheryl's comment is just so gracious, and I appreciate it. And I just appreciate being a part of this group so much that I hope we can continue in some way. And I hope maybe we can continue with an athlete, right? You know, or 2 or 3 or whatever, you know, this idea of how does this affect you personally? What do these ideas mean to you as an athlete? And so I just so appreciate this moment.
Thank you, Jamie. And one thing that struck me, and I'm going to circle back to you, Anna, even though you took your hand down, is the policies that Anna was talking about. A lot of it don't touch a lot of our daily lives. We study the policies, but we don't interact with the policies as athletes like Angel does with her clientele. You know, at the USOPC, you're sitting in on these meetings, and you're living that. So I think that perspective in and of itself is really fascinating. So Anna, what were you going to say?
Jamie had such a beautiful comment that I took my hand down, because I was like, oh, this, she's just saying everything that I also am thinking. But I really appreciated kind of being sandwiched by Jamie and Cheryl, in that a lot of times when I study these policies, especially ones with female eligibility, female athlete triad, they have a long history. And a lot of questions are, what is new about this policy? What is different besides what's on the surface? Like, obviously it's for female eligibility, it's regulating testosterone rather than requiring surgery, but what is new? Or sorry, not surgery, that's for trans policies, but you get my gist. And I really appreciated having kind of what Jamie said about this kind of, I wrote it down, I kind of jotted it down, but I ditto what Cheryl said and Jamie said about having these kind of old anxieties culminating in new technologies. And Cheryl kind of bringing it back with those 3 points around there's something old and new about each one of these policies. And I think it's really fascinating too, when I talk to a lot of my participants, they simultaneously advocate for intersectional feminism while also believing that there should be a female eligibility policy. And these really interesting contradictions, which every panelist spoke about today, is so fascinating to me, in that you see those elements of the old and the new coming through in how they're articulated in contemporary power relations dynamics, what is on media, what is the business model. And it's really cool to kind of take a step back and see how all of our perspectives have those business, cultural, historical, sociological, lived experience, psychological elements to create a really complex idea of surveillance through multiple mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good summary, Anna, of the panel. Thank you. Really good. So let me pose this to the panel, because I think this might be a good next question. Is we've talked about all the different pieces of surveillance, so many, and were there any that we missed? Just real quick, where they're like, ooh, we didn't talk about that. We could have a panel of 50 people talking about this. What did we miss? Angel?
I think the one thing that stuck out to me that we could probably talk about for days is how media portrayal and coverage is different. We touched on it a little bit, right? With looking at the different WNBA players and which ones got more hits and likes and was a part of the conversation, despite another, player of a different hue that had other kind of accolades attached, right? But I think one thing that kind of sticks out for me is the language that is used in the description of different women in sport. And so time and time again, for example, I'll say the sport of tennis, you have this up and coming rising star, Coco Gauff. Commentators tend to constantly compare her to Venus and Serena and not anyone else. Or when you talk about specifically Black athletes or Black women athletes specifically, they are talked about in an animalistic way, as opposed to a skillful, tactical, competent way. And so that is something that we could probably talk about for days.
We absolutely could. And I'm looking at our sociologists that probably can answer that question, because there is some documentation of that over time. Jamie? Don't take your hand down. I saw it.
I thought we were going to hear from our brilliant sociologist at that point. It was such a nice handoff. But I don't know if anybody saw this recent story out of the University of Oregon, where they were monitoring, if we're talking about surveillance, all these biometrics, and Anna's nodding. She's a track athlete and probably knows more about this. But the biometrics and sort of the BMI and the DEXA scans of women athletes, and prescribing certain workouts and certain diets based on that. I mean, we're getting down to, when we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about like what's going on inside you, like, and just shaming people for not meeting certain standards, and subjecting them to certain exercise regimens based on some preconceived notions of what an athlete should look like. So that's one thing that we didn't touch on, is sort of some of these scientific aspects that people are monitoring, and this idea that science is somehow objective, and so then it's free of bias. And we know that's not true. And I'm going to stop talking now, but maybe that's one of the things we're missing. And we've got, 132 people here. I'd love to hear what we're missing. If anybody has a comment in the chat or anyplace else.
Yeah, throw it in the chat. Yeah, and no, I think as we're going to all this wearable technologies and analytics that we can monitor and surveil bodies at the micro level about hydration and sleep and steps, and all of this, that in this kind of neoliberal framework of performance, I think this is both problematic, and then the coaching science and performance science people love it. So like, what do you do with that? I think there's some really ethical implications that I don't think we talk about enough. Anne?
Well, I guess sometimes maybe I might be the naive one on the panel, but there's some things in the surveillance of these numbers and these things that are actually positive, I think. So for the first time ever, we have talking about tracking menstruation as a performance enhancer, when the US women's soccer team did it to win the World Cup, and using it in their training. So the first time we got away from stigmatization of talking about it, and it became something that actually could be talked about positively in a way to maybe increase in performance. And now I may be wrong on that, but I thought at least it's shifted the conversation a little bit. And then I think about some of the other metrics, and maybe again, naively, I think if we could show how hard Carly Lloyd kicks a soccer ball when she's in a game, and using that technology, and be able to show that's just as amazing as the men who are kicking at the same time. So maybe there is a way to get rid of these stereotypes that women athletes are less than, when you can use the metrics to show their incredible strength and abilities. So tell me I'm wrong.
I hadn't thought of that, Anne. That's a really good point. Nancy, you had your hand up earlier, so I want to honor that. And then I'm watching. This is hard because I'm trying to pay attention and moderate at the same time, and I just want to kick back and listen. So Nancy, what do you have?
I just want to jump in here with the notion of biometrics, because this to me goes back to the policy piece. And again, the younger generation beginning to understand that there's a very ethical question there. Who owns the data, right? So this notion of capturing this data off these athletes, why is it that that's not their data to then decide who gets to use that data, right? And that's for all athletes, but that gets into the policy side, and Anna has her hand up, so she can come on in on that one.
Yeah, and I do want to, we are asking the audience what we're missing, and Talia up in Canada, hi Talia, is talking about the surveillance of mothers, the female athlete mothers, and that came up during the Tokyo Olympics, of what's a good and bad mother and how we surveil mother athletes and not their male counterparts. Anna.
I don't have an answer to the question, the great question about how we talk about mothers, especially in high performance sport, but I do think it's really interesting in talking about biometrics, especially with things like RED-S, female athlete triad. Something that I see a lot in various consensus statements or documents that kind of encourage that kind of surveillance for the purpose of athlete health, especially around female athletes, women athletes, is the exact language from a policy I'm looking at is it's really difficult to determine if an athlete has relative energy deficiency in sport because it is a bit scientific. It's not readily, it's a complex equation. So you should identify suspicious looking athletes that look like they have RED-S, which brings up a really kind of interesting discussion around the language of suspicious athletes, because you have those motivations and rationales. You're trying to make sure that women are not engaging in unhealthy behaviors, hurting their bodies and harming their performance. But at what point does it become, what if you have a suspicious athlete, what is a normal athlete then? And kind of balancing, and who owns them, like we said, who owns those biometrics, who has access to them? And if you can't access that technology, you're just relying on your idea of what a healthy athlete should look like. And so I think it's a really interesting, I don't have answers, but a really interesting ethical, sociological, historical, scientific question of how do you balance ideas of what a female athlete should look like and those biometrics.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to kick up to Beth here, but one comment from the chat, if you're following, is that Hannah said the biometrics are also helping us show that women are not small men. Ding, ding, if I had a bell, I'd ding, 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 right? So good point, Beth, and then to Cheryl.
I just wanted to throw out there too, when we're thinking about biometrics, that consideration for development and particularly youth athletes and their cognitive capacity, their emotional capacity to critically consume that information. So a lot of these problems that we see around eating disorders, body dysmorphia and so forth, they don't begin in adulthood, right? They begin much earlier than that. And so if we have youth athletes wearing technologies to track their food and their steps and so forth, we really don't want to treat them like adults. They are cognitively and emotionally different than adults. So I think that's another piece to kind of layer in.
All right, so we've got children are not adults and women are not men. I mean, this is, for those tuning in, this is, this might be novel, but, when we're thinking of surveillance and how these identities start getting treated and what are the different ways that people experience all these different forms of surveillance, it has real mental, physical, developmental implications. Dr. Cookie, and then I'm going to kick it to Dr. Walker. I want to hear what your thought. I can see your wheel turning there. Cheryl, you're on mute.
There's always got to be somebody. So
Always that one. That's all right.
Had Dr. Cookie on their bingo sheet, shoot me an email and I'll send you a prize. I'll give you a free copy of my upcoming book. So anyway, one participant per contest, whatever the anyway. Where was I going with this? Oh no, so I'm hoping somebody in the audience or maybe somebody on the panel can help me out here, because I came across this headline and I thought it was so provocative because I had never thought about the two together. Those of us that have been following the news in the United States may have followed the story about some of the anti-abortion laws that are being passed in the state of Texas, and certainly those of us that are invested in reproductive justice and reproductive rights for all individuals who identify as women. This is certainly, I think, on the forefront. And a number of athletes have been speaking out on these issues and connecting reproductive health and reproductive justice with athletic participation, and athletes' ability to have control, bodily autonomy over their reproduction. It's as a way to sort of think about and preserve sport performance. Did anybody else come across this headline? Is it just me? And can somebody help me connect the dots here? Because I just thought that those were two worlds that I hadn't put together. And so I'm thinking specifically about how it is that laws that seemingly have really no connection to sport are actually having real implications on women athletes and sport performance.
Nancy, do you want to jump in on that one?
Just briefly, Cheryl, absolutely. I believe the WNBA Players Association has taken a stance, and I see that in line with all that they've done in the social justice space. So it's consistent, right, with how they have a collective voice. And I think they've really been the role models for social justice, going all the way back, I'm sure even before Black Lives Matters, but yeah, that's what I see happening here. And it's interesting because it's a risky move on their part, I think, in some ways. But as I mentioned, it seems like we are now in an era where some of these sponsors and advertisers, which is who they'd be afraid of offending, are actually supporting them, right? And being willing to take stances that are in line with the values of what they say their company is about. So it is part of that really interesting time of challenging the systems of power that have been in place, in my mind.
Interesting. Neff, what's on your mind?
A lot. I've just been taking it all in and jotting down notes and taking mental notes of all the brilliant things that have been said. But to build on what Nancy said a little bit, when I think about the sponsors and the decisions that they're making, I have to think about they're trying to make money, right? Like at some point, it's their organizations, and organizations are sort of built to sustain themselves, and they churn people in and out. And it's very difficult for me to think that they're doing it because they just want to be good organizations, right? Because organizations, in my mind at least, aren't inherently good. But to your point, Nancy, something else is driving them. And I think at least some of the research, and this isn't my area at all, but some of the research that I've read trying to understand what the next generation of consumers will look like and some of the things they want, we know that Gen Z in particular, like they're very concerned with, one, women's sports. They're very interested in women's sports. Two, social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sustainability. And these are all things that are in some ways aligned with some of these more progressive thoughts around, for instance, whether women should be able to make decisions about their bodies. So I feel like, in a lot of ways, these big corporations that sponsor the WNBA, which is in some ways tied to the NBA sponsorship deals, they're reading the tea leaves, right? And they're seeing that their consumers of the future are going to want them to be making decisions that are in alignment with whether it's social justice or whether it's the WNBA players or not. So that's just, I don't have anything super intelligent to say about that, but I think it's interesting to see how they are aligned with the players in the W, which typically are motivated by progressive ideals. And that alignment with these really big organizations, whether it be AT&T, who sometimes is progressive and sometimes is much more conservative in the ways that they're treating their employees, it's just really interesting to see big business in alignment with such a progressive organization like the WNBA and supporting them.
Mm-hmm. And as long as we're sort of on the WNBA, and Neff, you mentioned how they really took the lead when they were in the wobble over the summer of 2020 with the racial reckoning. We had two people separately asked a version of this question, is with that visibility and maybe perhaps the responsibility that they took on during that time, and I would argue still have that responsibility and mantle. How much do we all think that social media and the surveillance of women, particularly Black women in the WNBA, has impacted Black women, good or bad? And two people have asked that question.
That's a really hard question. I mean, I'll take a shot at it since my
Okay.
since I'm still off mute. But I think Black women have always been under surveillance, you know, in this country from the very beginning, right? We can go back to 1619, but we don't have the time. But I think certainly Black women in sport have been under surveillance, and we've seen it with whether it be Serena Williams over the years. We've seen it with numerous track athletes. We've seen it with sex testing. Like we've seen it in sports over and over and over again, where Black women are tested and attempted to control, and certainly surveilled more than other groups. So we understand the negative impact of that, right? But I think in some ways, at least with the WNBA players, we've seen some positive impact. So going back to what Ann brought up earlier, and also some of the data that Ann has, I mean, if you look at a lot of, you know, the slides that Ann presented today, a lot of it was suggesting that in some ways, Black women are reaping the benefits of surveillance when it comes to social media. I mean, certainly when we look at how the big journal companies and the big, you know, whether it's ESPN, ABC, whatever, or they're the same company, Sports Illustrated, whatever it might be, whether they're actually looking at the data and making their decisions on who they cover based on the data, that's a different story, right? And certainly Cheryl can tell us all about that. But I think when we just look at the increase in their viewership, the increase in the engagement on their social media, in some ways, Black women are benefiting from this increase in surveillance on social media. They're able to package their brand in very different ways. They're able to have control over their brand and be authentic in ways that they weren't before. They can push back a lot of times, I think, on the sponsors, because if a sponsor is trying to get them behave in a way that they haven't been behaving with on social media, then there's this big disconnect between authenticity, right? And that's certainly not what they would want as a sponsor, is to have someone acting inauthentically to who they really are, especially when the world knows who they are because of social media. So I think it's been really helpful as far as helping Black women in some ways decrease the access to opportunities when it comes to sponsorships, because, you know, you have folks like Ann doing the research showing us the discrepancies in the numbers and the ways that these Black women are increasing their engagement and the ways that fans are paying attention to them.
Yeah, I was really struck by Ann's slide on the three most marketable female athletes, Biles, Harris, and Osaka. And it struck me that, you know, 2 out of the 3 were women of color and 1 is an out gay woman. And so, you know, I wonder, there's upside, but is there also a downside? Because we saw, as Angel was pointing out, you know, the surveillance of high performance athletes with Biles and Osaka this summer, sort of pulling back and being criticized but lauded. And those choices aren't made in a vacuum. They're made within the context of what we're talking about here. So I just thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition.
And I'll stop after this because now I'm talking too much. But I think this, what you just brought up, shows the connection between surveillance and control, right? I mean, the added surveillance also led to some added control, both by fans as well as even, you know, you think about Osaka in particular, you know, events demanding that she show up. Right? Like, you have to be here. You have to show up regardless of whatever health issues that you're having, mental health or not, that's a health issue, right? But demanding that she shows up. And again, I think that's tied in some ways to surveillance, that idea of control.
Angel, do you want to react to, Angel or Beth are more psych-oriented panelists. Do you want to react to maybe the negative downsides of that real quickly? Or not? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I was waiting to see who was going to unmute first. No, this is a fascinating conversation, right? And this by no means is speaking from a first-person account for anyone that is assumed to be associated with the clientele base or the work that I do. But I think, Nephew, you eloquently, you know, articulated the give and take and the paradox, right? And so on one hand, yes, the marketability is there. And then on the other hand, there is this entitlement piece that doesn't get talked about a lot. And the, again, the encroachment on the personal space and how to manage that particular energy that is required for someone who is constantly accessible in these different media spaces. And then it goes back to that sentiment of control. And we know from a psychological, mental health, behavioral health standpoint that control is like the impetus of all things that relate to anxiety and the way that it manifests in so many different ways. So I can go on and on about how there's like this give and take and this interplay between this sense of control that has so much implications for mental health and mental well-being. So I'm going to stop there because then I'm going to get on my soapbox. But yes, I'm interested to hear more from Beth.
Yeah, I'll just add kind of, I think a related piece is that, of course, to become an elite athlete, in some ways you do learn to silence your body's signals across the spectrum, right? Your physical signals, your mental signals, and everything. You have to push through. And we reinforce that within a lot of sport structures where athletes kind of abdicate control over their training and so forth to coaches, not necessarily consciously or willingly, but that's just the structure of sport a lot of the time. And I think what we're seeing with some of these athletes like Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka is that they are pushing back against the silencing. They are speaking out against all of that control that has yielded to authorities. And that seems to me to be really a culture change at the moment, and potentially very productive for their own mental health, because control is very important. Agency is very important to feeling efficacious and to having positive psychological experiences. So I think that's sort of a related issue.
Absolutely. So we have about 15 minutes left and 204 questions. As the moderator, because I want every panelist to answer this question, because it's coming up in the Q&A and in the chat, is about how do we, as fans of women's sport, as scholars of women's sport from various perspectives, people that care about female athletes and women in sport, how do we resist? What is one positive thing we can take control of? We can show our agency, we can resist, because there are a lot of negative implications. But what is the one thing from your perspective, and some of you have mentioned different strategies, so you can reaffirm those, or maybe you've come up with a new one of, let's end with, what can we do to resist surveillance, from whatever that means to you? And start us off.
Well, I think we talked a lot about this tonight, and so I'll go back to where my home is and think about social media. And so we, as much as we're talking about athletes have an agency, we as fans and consumers and scholars all have agency on these platforms as well. And we have seen them, as much as they are the negative side, the power that can happen through using them and building a crowd is what we saw when Sedona Prince put that video out. It's allowing us, when I go back to what I said, is forcing the media now to cover what we want it to cover and to bring the proper, maybe positive surveillance to the issues. So I do think that there is some power in there. I'm not going to lie and say it's all rosy when you step onto the platforms and advocate. It certainly isn't. We've all experienced the downside, but there is a power that we can use that to change the types of surveillance that we see in traditional media.
Thank you, Anne. Neff.
Yeah, if I can build off Anne, I absolutely agree, right? I think the combination of the counter spaces that I mentioned and how those can be sort of these, they're essentially safe spaces, right? They're really centered on the individuals who are, whether it be aggrieved or whether it be oppressed, but these are safe spaces for folks to be. And if I think about Anne's research, hashtag WNBA Twitter is a safe space for people who follow the WNBA and want to engage on topics related to the WNBA to just be themselves without having the trolls tell them they're not dunking enough, for instance. So I think if we can create and engage more counter spaces throughout women's sports, we can control our own narratives. We can engage in the sports. We can watch the sports. We can grow the sports in the ways that we want it to be without having to manage or deal with or cope with the trolls or cover identities based on, who we are with and who's around us. So safe counter spaces, I think, is the way to go. And if you can create those counter spaces on social media and blend the work that I do with Anne's, that's even better.
Okay, what other actionable resistance to surveillance do we have to put forth? Nancy.
Well, it makes sense that I would piggyback on Anne and Neff, because I see what's happening on social media as a game changer. I see the athletes, as I mentioned, taking and owning their own power to overcome surveillance, and fans doing the same. So without question, that opportunity to express a voice in whatever format is critical. But I think, to take a page from you, Dr. Lavoie, data, right? Every time we use data to support these points that we're making, it is beginning to get the attention of people in ways that maybe it hasn't in the past. So one of the beautiful things about being scholars, and of course for students that are part of this as well, is using your voice, but also using the data to back up your voice. So it's not just opinion that you're throwing out there in the conversation. You are adding something of substance to really push the issue and resist, as you said.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that everybody from their different disciplines were grounding their comments tonight from different scientific perspectives within their discipline, because all kinds of knowledge matter. And the more we bring the types of knowledge and data to the forefront, that's how we can also create change. Angel.
I'd say, given, the many different, respective roles that are represented. So whether we're researchers, instructors, media representatives, I know there are tons of diverse people in the audience. I think the first thing is to return back to the population that we're talking about, which is the athlete. We collect data on athletes, especially at the elite level, all day long, but how much of that data is being explained to them? How much are they a part of the conversation? Because they can only give so much. And what I have learned over the years is that a lot of times it's a very transactional relationship that athletes have with multiple stakeholders who have a genuine interest. However, they're not engaged and involved with the processes that follow the data collection. Their voices are silenced. And so reflecting on ourselves in terms of how much we're perpetuating the silence of the voice of the athlete experience, I think, is extremely important for all of us, no matter what role we play.
Thank you. Cheryl.
Yeah, I think in addition to some of the things that have already been said, for me, I've become somewhat disenchanted, frustrated with making an argument or making a case for more coverage of women's sports in legacy media spaces. I've been doing that for 20 plus years. My colleague Mike Messner has been doing that for even longer. And so for me, I think, I don't know if it's age or just being tired or what, but I think I'm less invested in that. And so for me, I think what we can do, and I'm not sure if this gets at your question, but I think what we can do is start consuming and engaging in the media spaces that are covering women's sports and talking about women's sports in the ways that we want to talk about. And I probably am piggybacking or maybe amplifying and echoing some things that both Neff and Nancy and Anne have already kind of talked about. I posted this in the chat a while ago. I signed up for the email newsletter, Just Women's Sports.
Mhm.
And it was a game changer for me because I've always struggled with, the following day I read in the paper, sorry, I still call it the paper. Like my news feed, right? My New York Times news feed or whatever. It's like, oh, this game happened or this event happened or this something had happened within the world of women's sports. And I'm like, how did I not know about this? Just Women's Sports is giving you, I mean, not just the WNBA, not just the women's soccer league, right? But like college lacrosse, a tournament that's happening. These are the key things that are happening in the world of sports. There's so many other really great spaces, and I think there's a diversity of voices now that's in part due to social media, wherein we can hear from women, we can hear from feminist women about women's sports, talking about women's sports. I'm thinking about Burn It All Down. I'm thinking about journalists that you might want to follow on Twitter, Julie DeCaro, Lindsay Gibbs, Jessica Luther. There are feminist sports journalists out there. There is feminist sports media content out there. And I think for those of us that are invested in this space, we need to start supporting those outlets, supporting those voices. And I'm using this opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that. A couple more that I would add to that are the Gist and the Black Sportswoman. And there's the WISP Women in Sports podcasts and Women in Sport Business. There are a lot of emergent things that we can support besides legacy media to make to resist and to lift up. So thank you for starting that conversation. Anna.
Maybe this is a bit simple, but because I've been reading a lot of policies, I'm in the middle of dissertation writing, so everything is dissertation, but being intentional about how we talk about women and their bodies, not just in sport, but in other realms as well. Because as we talked about, women's sport we see these linkages to society everywhere. And even if we talk about women athletes and women's sports in a particular way, making sure that we retain that language, that very intentional language in other spaces, because women are surveyed, they have their surveillance mechanisms outside of sport as well. And so being very intentional and strategic in our language, as well with our students too. It's something that I always, when I teach, tell my students, when I talk about these policies, be very intentional about how you're describing these women. Are you calling them suspicious? They are real women. Don't say that they're not. Like, be very intentional and intentional with your language, not just for women's sport, but other spheres as well.
Great. Simple but profound, Anna. Love it. Beth, and then Jamie.
I think I can kind of build on Anna's advice. I was recently at a car dealership having service done, and there was probably a 4-year-old girl there with her grandmother, and one of the male employees of the service center said to this little girl, like, "Oh, I love your dress." And she looked at him and smiled, and everyone laughed, and it was fine. And then on my way out, I happened to be waiting for my car, and this little girl was there with her grandmother outside at the same time, and we started chatting. And I asked this little girl, "What's your favorite subject in school?" And she looked at me with surprise, and I said, "I'm a teacher." And she said, "Oh," and it was this whole other experience she was having of this adult woman talking to her. And so I think that's absolutely right, Anna, that we need to generalize some of these issues we're talking about into broader spaces. And I would say we need to include boys as well. So we need to expose boys and girls to agentic, powerful images, maybe female athletes, women in business, whatever it might be, because unfortunately the preponderance of images they see are more stereotyped and sexualized. So we need to disrupt that in any way we can in our own lives, and advocating for it in media and so forth.
Great, thank you. Jamie.
Well, I'm muted.
Good.
I have forgotten everything I wanted to say because I have two daughters and they are almost 8 and almost 10. And I just think this generation is so different than the, I'm almost 50, right? They're so different. My 9-year-old, almost 10-year-old daughter's best friend is a trans girl. And I tell her, there's people that don't want your best friend to play sports with girls. And she thinks that's ridiculous. It doesn't compute to her that her best friend was not assigned female at birth. She's like, in every sense, my best friend is a girl, and it doesn't. So I'm so caught up in this idea of like daughters all of a sudden that I've completely forgotten what I want to say, because it's so much bigger than just elite sport or all the things that we've been talking about. But so many of the things that people have mentioned just resonate with me. Like in the last few years, we've paid attention to women athletes who say no, right? Whether it's Simone Biles or Naomi Osaka or any other woman, or Sedona Price, who says, no, these, weight rooms are not acceptable at the NCAA tournament. And we're finally paying attention. Women have been saying no for a very long time, and we haven't paid attention. And I don't know if it's social media or if it's these other, platforms that makes us pay attention, but we're finally paying attention to when people say no, and we're respecting that and we're amplifying it. Nancy talked about the importance of data. And I was lucky enough to go to graduate school with women who had been involved in the AIAW and the implementation of Title IX, and they told us repeatedly, hit people with the data, because if you tell them the ideology behind Title IX, they're not going to care, but if you show them the numbers, it makes it meaningful, right? So that data matters, and that's why studies that people like Cheryl put together are so important, right? We can show 5% is not enough of the I just sent my students out this morning and I said, I gave them the list of the top, sports websites and 10 most popular. And I said, how many stories are about women? And they only found one this morning. And that was about Carly Lloyd retiring, right? So it was about one athlete retire. It wasn't about the game itself. It was about, and she, all credit to Carly Lloyd, 17 years is an incredible career, but what are the stories we're telling about men, and what are the stories we're telling about women, and what are we celebrating? And finally, this idea about feminist sports media, and this is why the Tucker Center is so important, is because it's this opportunity to amplify these voices that deserve and need to be amplified, not just for women, but for anybody who cares about sport. And I don't have anywhere I want to go with this, but that's it.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for that very kind plug. And we've got some other plugs in the chats. Goals Sports is another feminist sport media that we want to follow, and Shot Clock Media. And Anne, I think you put in Women Times Sport Business. Did I say that right? Okay. So many good thoughts. We're drawing near. Our colleagues on the East Coast, it's past your bedtime. And our colleagues on the West Coast, we're just heading into happy hour here. So thank you, everybody around the world, around the US, in all different communities, for joining us tonight. My heart is full, my brain is full. For all my colleagues on the screen, the panelists, you're amazing women. I appreciate all of you. And as we close tonight, take care of yourselves. Show yourself grace, and let's always let data tell the story. Thank you for tuning in.